In the dry open lands of New Mexico, where dust storms rolled across endless plains and danger hid behind every shadow, a boy was born who would one day face death itself. And win. His name was Elfego Baca, and his story is one of courage, pride, and the fight for justice when justice was nowhere to be found. But before he became a legend, before the newspapers called him the man who couldn't be killed, he was just a small, curious boy, trying to survive in a world that didn't believe someone like him could ever matter. Elfego was born on February 10, 1865, in a small town called Socorro, deep in the New Mexico territory. This was not the America we know today. The Civil War had ended, but the Wild West was still wild. Gunmen ruled dusty streets. Cattle thieves crossed borders without fear. And for many people, especially Mexican Americans, the law was not protection. It was a threat. Elfego's family lived with both hope and hardship. His father, Frisco Baca, was a hard-working man, strong, proud, and known for his sense of honor. His mother, Juana Maria, was gentle and loving, the kind of woman who taught her son right from wrong with soft hands and strong faith. But life on the frontier was never kind for long. When Elfego was still a child, the family left New Mexico and moved to Topeka, Kansas, hoping for a better future. But tragedy followed them. His mother fell ill and soon passed away. Her death changed everything. The boy who once laughed in the sunlight of his mother's kitchen now stood quiet beside her grave, watching the world grow darker around him. After her death, Francisco took his son back to New Mexico. They settled in Belen, a small town surrounded by dust and danger. There, Francisco became a town marshal, the law in a place where most men made their own. Young Elfego watched his father walk the streets with a star on his chest and a gun at his side. He saw what it meant to face trouble without fear, to protect the weak, even when the odds were bad. Sometimes when his father cleaned his revolver at night, Elfego would ask, "Papa, what makes a man brave?" His father would look at him, tired but proud, and say, "Bravery isn't about killing, son. It's about standing your ground when the world tells you to run." Those words stayed with Elfego forever. As he grew older, Elfego saw the worst side of the West. He saw drunken cowboys ride into town and shoot their guns in the air just for fun. He saw innocent people beaten because they spoke Spanish instead of English. The land was wild, but the hearts of some men were wilder. By the time he turned 18, Elfego had already decided he would become the law. Not for power, not for fame, but to prove that justice belonged to everyone, not just the rich or the white. He was small in size, but not in spirit. He carried himself with quiet confidence, dark eyes sharp, voice calm, smile rare but honest. When people looked at him, they saw a young Mexican boy who should have stayed in the background, but Elfego saw something else, a man of purpose. He learned to shoot, not for killing, but for protection. He studied how the law worked and how it was often twisted against his people. He swore that if he ever wore a badge, he'd use it the right way, not as a weapon, but as a promise. The frontier was a land of endless conflict, and for Elfego, the fight was not just against criminals. It was against prejudice, injustice, and the belief that someone like him couldn't make a difference. But he would, and the chance to prove it came sooner than he ever imagined. In October 1884, Elfego was 19. He had taken on the role of deputy sheriff, though some said he appointed himself. It didn't matter. The people of the small settlement called Frisco, now known as Reserve, New Mexico, were desperate. Cowboys, drunk and violent, rode through the town, firing guns and terrorizing locals. The law was weak, the fear was strong, but not for Elfego. He stepped out into the street one morning, sunlight cutting across his face, and walked straight toward the danger. There was a man, Charlie McCarty, a cowboy known for his temper. He had been drinking, shouting, and firing shots into the sky. No one dared stop him, no one but Elfego Baca. The crowd watched as the young deputy stood in front of the drunk cowboy, hand resting on his revolver. "Charlie," he said calmly, "you've had enough. Put the gun down." The cowboy laughed, thinking it was a joke, but Elfego didn't flinch. When the man refused, Elfego arrested him on the spot, in broad daylight. The people were stunned. No one had ever dared to challenge the cowboys, but Elfego wasn't done. That single arrest would soon light a fuse that would explode into one of the most unbelievable battles in Wild West history. In the days that followed, word spread across the hills and ranches. Dozens of cowboys, angry and armed, rode toward Frisco to free their friend and take revenge. What came next would last for more than a day and fill the air with thousands of bullets. And through it all, one man, one 19-year-old deputy, would stand his ground and refuse to die. The morning sun hung low over the small frontier town of Frisco, New Mexico. The streets were empty, except for the dust swirling through the air and a few faces watching nervously from behind wooden doors. The smell of gunpowder still lingered, from the day before, when Elfego Baca had arrested Charlie McCarty, a drunken cowboy who thought no one in town could stop him. Elfego had proved him wrong, but now the town was holding its breath. Everyone knew that McCarty's friends would come looking for revenge. These weren't ordinary men. They were hard, angry cowboys, men who lived by their own rules and who saw a young Mexican lawman as an insult to their pride. Word spread fast through the canyons and ranches. A kid with a badge had dared to arrest one of them. By evening, riders began to gather. By nightfall, the hills around Frisco glowed with campfires. The cowboys were coming. Elfego Baca knew what that meant. He was only 19, but he had already seen enough violence to understand what was coming next. Still, he refused to leave. He told the townspeople calmly, "I'll face them. They think I'll run, but I won't." He found an old adobe house on the edge of town, a small one-room structure with thick clay walls. That would be his fortress. He moved inside, checked his revolvers, and waited. It didn't take long. A group of cowboys rode into town shouting his name. They demanded he release Charlie McCarty, but McCarty was already in custody miles away. Elfego stepped out to tell them so. The cowboys didn't care. To them, it wasn't about the arrest anymore. It was about pride and control. They wanted to make an example out of him. The first shot rang out, echoing through the valley. Then another. Within minutes, the air filled with gunfire. Bullets struck the walls of the small adobe house as Elfego rushed back inside. The siege had begun. For hours, the cowboys fired from every direction. The adobe walls cracked and chipped, but they held firm. Elfego stayed low, calm and focused. He had positioned himself near a small hole in the wall, just wide enough to aim through. Whenever a cowboy tried to get closer, Elfego fired a single, sharp shot. He didn't waste bullets. Every pull of the trigger was measured, controlled. Outside, the cowboys grew furious. They expected him to be dead within minutes. Instead, he was making fools of them. They began shouting insults, firing wildly into the walls. Inside the little house, Elfego whispered to himself, "They'll run out of courage before I run out of faith." By the next morning, the attackers had grown in number. Some said there were 40 men. Others claimed there were more than 80. Every one of them carried rifles, revolvers, and anger. They surrounded the small house completely. The ground was littered with empty shells. Smoke hung in the air like fog. Yet somehow the man inside was still alive. A few of the braver cowboys decided to rush the door. Elfego waited. When they came close, he fired through the cracks, precise and deadly. 2 men fell instantly. The others scattered back behind the rocks. The attackers realized something horrifying. They were up against a man who refused to die. For nearly 2 days, the shootout raged on. Some reports said the cowboys fired over 4,000 bullets into that little house. Holes appeared in the roof, the door shattered, and chunks of adobe fell to the floor. Yet Elfego remained untouched. When the firing stopped briefly, he used the quiet to reload and pray. His hands were steady, his heart calm. Outside, the cowboys argued among themselves. "He's dead by now," one said. Another shook his head. "No, I saw him move. They decided to burn him out. They shot flaming rags at the roof, hoping to smoke him to death, but the old adobe didn't catch. The smoke rose and drifted away." Elfego stayed where he was, breathing slow, waiting for the next move. By the second night, the attackers were running out of options and ammunition. They had lost men and pride. Every bullet that didn't hit its mark was a reminder that their target was still alive. Some of them began to whisper that he was protected by something greater, luck, God, or maybe a curse. They had never seen anything like it. Finally, exhausted and humiliated, the cowboys decided to end it. They offered him safe passage if he surrendered. Elfego agreed, but on one condition. He would not be harmed or disarmed until he stood before a judge. They accepted. As he stepped out of the battered adobe house, sunlight hit his face. The walls behind him were riddled with bullet holes, hundreds of them. The ground was covered in empty shells. But Elfego walked tall, straight, and uninjured. The cowboys stared in disbelief. One man muttered, "He ain't human." Another crossed himself silently. Elfego climbed onto his horse and rode away under guard. Behind him, the little house stood as proof of the impossible. A few days later, he was formally charged with murder. During the shootout, at least 4 cowboys had been killed. The case drew attention across the territory. Some called him a murderer. Others called him a hero. But in court, the truth came out. Witnesses testified that the cowboys had attacked first. Elfego had only defended himself. The judge listened, nodded, and finally spoke the words that would make history. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. For many in New Mexico's Hispanic community, that verdict meant more than one man's freedom. It was a victory for all of them. Elfego Baca walked out of the courthouse a free man. The crowd outside cheered his name. And from that moment, his legend began to spread far beyond Frisco. People told the story in every town, and each time it grew. Some said he faced 100 men, others said 5,000 bullets. But everyone agreed on one thing. He was the man who couldn't be killed. Even years later, when Elfego Baca became a sheriff, a lawyer, and a respected leader, people still remembered that young deputy who had faced an army and survived. The little adobe house where it all happened became a symbol of courage. It still stands today in Reserve, New Mexico, a quiet monument to the day one man stood alone against the impossible. And though many years have passed since that fight, the story of Elfego Baca still burns bright in the heart of the Southwest, a reminder that bravery isn't about size, bullets, or power. It's about standing your ground when the world tells you to run. When the gunfire stopped in Frisco, the land fell silent. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and disbelief. The cowboys who had tried to kill Elfego Baca were gone, some dead, some wounded, all humiliated. And inside that tiny bullet-riddled house stood a young man who had just survived the impossible. But Elfego's story didn't end with the gunfight. It was only beginning. The next morning, soldiers and law officers arrived from nearby towns. They found thousands of shell casings scattered across the ground and walls so full of holes that sunlight poured through them like a sieve. And in the middle of that chaos, they found Elfego, calm, composed, cleaning his revolver. He was arrested immediately. The officials didn't know what to do with him. He had killed several men, that much was true. But he had also defended himself against an army. Was he a murderer or a hero? As word spread, the whole territory of New Mexico was divided. Some called him a savage Mexican outlaw who had murdered white cowboys. Others called him a brave young lawman who stood against injustice. For the first time in his life, Elfego Baca was not just a man, he was a symbol. When he arrived at the courthouse in Socorro, people lined the streets. They wanted to see the boy who had survived thousands of bullets. Newspapers sent reporters. Headlines called it the Frisco War and the Battle of Elfego Baca. He was charged with murder and assault with intent to kill. The prosecution claimed he had provoked the fight. They said he had killed without mercy. But Baca's defense was simple. He had done his duty. He stood in court tall and confident. His clothes were plain, his face calm. He didn't try to look like a hero. He didn't have to. The story spoke for itself. When the first witness took the stand, the courtroom was silent. A local resident described what had happened that day. He said, "The cowboys came to kill him. Everyone in town knew it. They fired first. He just stood his ground." Another witness spoke next. He said he saw the cowboys firing from every direction while Baca stayed behind the wall, only shooting when they charged. The judge leaned forward. "And what did the defendant do after the attack?" The witness replied, "He came out alive, sir." Walked right out, like he'd never been touched. The judge couldn't hide his surprise. Elfego Baca's lawyer argued that no man could face such odds and live unless he truly believed in what he was doing. He wasn't killing for glory, the lawyer said. He was protecting himself and protecting this town. If that's a crime, then there's no justice in New Mexico. The prosecutor tried to twist the facts. He said Elfego had brought the violence upon himself by arresting Charlie McCarty. Elfego finally spoke. His voice was steady, his words clear. He said, "If the law means nothing, then we are no better than the men who break it. I arrested that man because it was right. If I die for doing right, then I'll die proud," the courtroom murmured. Some people smiled. Others nodded. Days passed. The trial dragged on, and the tension grew heavier with every testimony. But Elfego never changed his expression. He didn't plead, he didn't cry. He trusted in his truth, and in the bullets still lodged in the walls of that old house. Finally, after long hours of argument, the jury went out to deliberate. The courthouse waited. When they returned, the foreman stood and said just 2 words. "Not guilty." The room erupted in cheers. People rushed forward to shake Elfego's hand. Outside, the crowd celebrated in the dusty street. For many Mexican Americans, it was more than a verdict. It was hope. Elfego Baca had proven that courage and justice could still win in a world that often forgot both. After the trial, his fame exploded. Newspapers across the West printed his story. They called him the invincible lawman. Some described him as a miracle, others as a man chosen by destiny. But Elfego never claimed to be a hero. When a reporter asked how he had survived thousands of bullets, he just smiled and said, "They couldn't hit me." That's all there is to it. Simple, proud, fearless. But fame comes with a price. As his legend grew, so did the jealousy. Some lawmen didn't like the attention he received. Others doubted his story. Whispers spread that maybe he had exaggerated the number of attackers, or that luck had saved him more than skill. Elfego didn't care. He knew what had happened, and so did the people who had seen it. Instead of arguing, he moved forward. He decided that his life would not end with one fight. He had survived death once. Now he would build a life worth living. He continued working in law enforcement, first as a sheriff's deputy, then as sheriff of Socorro County. He became known not just for his bravery, but for his fairness. He treated everyone the same, rich or poor, white or Hispanic. When he wore his badge, it wasn't just metal on his chest. It was a promise. Still, he never forgot the feeling of being trapped in that little house, surrounded by men who wanted him dead. That memory stayed with him for the rest of his life. It reminded him why he had chosen this path in the first place, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Years later, he told a friend, "They fired 4,000 shots at me and couldn't kill me. I guess God had other plans." Maybe he did. Because that trial didn't just free Elfego Baca. It created a legend that would echo across generations. He became a symbol of pride for the people of New Mexico, a living reminder that courage can rise from the most unlikely places. And as the story of the shootout traveled from town to town, it began to change. Some said there were 50 attackers. Others said 100. Some said he was hit but never bled. The truth was already turning into legend. But beneath all the exaggeration, one thing never changed. Elfego Baca had faced an army, stood alone, and survived. And from that moment on, he was no longer just a man. He was a name whispered in awe, the man who could not be killed. After the trial, Elfego Baca walked out of the courthouse a free man and a legend. Crowds followed him down the dusty street, cheering his name. Reporters shouted questions, children ran beside his horse, and old men tipped their hats. The story of the Frisco shootout spread like wildfire across New Mexico. Some said he had faced 50 men. Others swore it was 100. But no matter how the numbers changed, one truth remained. Elfego Baca had stood alone and survived. He had tasted fame, but what mattered more to him was purpose. He didn't want to live as a hero of one lucky fight. He wanted to become a man of law, a protector of the people who had no one else to stand for them. In 1888, only a few years after the gunfight, Baca became sheriff of Socorro County. He pinned a silver badge on his chest, looked into a cracked mirror, and smiled. To most men, that star was a symbol of authority. To him, it was a promise. The territory of New Mexico was still wild, an untamed land of miners, drifters, and desperados. Outlaws crossed the border from Texas and Arizona, thinking the desert would hide them. But when they entered Socorro County, they met Sheriff Baca. He patrolled the land on horseback, hat pulled low, revolver holstered but always ready. He rode through storms, across rivers, and into towns where men carried rifles like walking sticks. Wherever he went, people whispered, "That's the one who lived through Frisco." At first, the criminals laughed at the stories. They thought they were just tales told by scared townsfolk. Then they met him. One afternoon, a group of horse thieves tried to ambush him near the Rio Grande. They shouted at him to drop his gun and walk away. Elfego didn't move. He simply said, "You can have my horse when you pry him from under me." Moments later, the thieves realized their mistake. Within seconds, Baca's revolver flashed 3 times. When the smoke cleared, the fight was over. He dragged the surviving thief back to town and locked him in jail. Stories like that spread faster than the desert wind. Soon, criminals began avoiding Socorro County altogether. Some said the sheriff could stop bullets with his stare. Others said he was part ghost. Elfego Baca didn't correct them. Fear was the best weapon a lawman could have, justice for everyone, but Elfego wasn't just feared, he was respected. He believed the law should protect everyone, especially those who couldn't protect themselves. He made sure that Hispanic settlers, Native Americans, and poor farmers received the same fairness as wealthy ranchers. If a judge tried to dismiss a poor man's complaint, Elfego would argue until justice was done. If an English-speaking official tried to cheat a Spanish-speaking widow, Elfego would translate the law for her himself. He often said, "A badge means nothing if it shines only for some and not for all." For him, the law was personal. It was about dignity. After several years as sheriff, Baca's name had become known across the entire Southwest. He could have stopped there, rich in reputation, safe in his fame. But that wasn't enough. He wanted to learn how justice worked beyond the gun. So, in 1894, he studied law and passed the New Mexico bar exam. The once poor boy from Socorro became attorney Elfego Baca. He opened an office and began defending clients, many of whom were ordinary people cheated by powerful landowners or crooked officials. He spoke both English and Spanish fluently, bridging 2 worlds that rarely trusted each other. In court, he was calm but fierce. He argued cases with the same focus he once used in gunfights, steady, fearless, and sharp. Judges respected him, lawyers feared him, and his community adored him, but Baca's influence didn't stop with the courtroom. He also became a mayor, a school superintendent, and a district attorney. Wherever he served, he fought for education, safety, and the rights of the poor. He met governors, senators, even U.S. Marshals. When disputes arose between settlers and officials, Baca was often the one called to mediate. He could sit across the table from men who once would have called him a Mexican boy, and now listen to them ask for his advice. Even as his hair began to gray, his pride never faded. He wore fine suits but still carried the revolver from Frisco, the one that had never failed him. Everywhere he went, the stories followed. People told them in saloons, schools, and campfires. Children played Elfego Baca with toy guns, pretending to be the man who couldn't be killed. Baca himself often laughed at the exaggerations. He once said, "I only fought one battle, and folks been shooting at me with stories ever since." Yet deep down, he understood what those stories meant. They weren't just about survival, they were about hope. To the people of New Mexico, Elfego Baca proved that courage could come from anyone, no matter their name, color, or birth. Still, fame brought challenges. Not everyone loved him. Some politicians feared his growing popularity. Others whispered that he had grown too proud, too confident, even arrogant. Baca ignored them, but the rumors hurt. He was human after all. Behind the fearless lawman was a man who longed for respect more than applause. He wanted his name to stand not just for gunfire and bravery, but for fairness, progress, and pride. In later years, he even became a U.S. Marshal, traveling across the territory enforcing federal law. He faced new dangers, but he faced them the same way he had always done, head-on, without fear. When asked how he managed to stay brave, he replied simply, "If a man's heart is clean, his shadow is never afraid of the dark." By the turn of the century, Elfego Baca had transformed from a teenage deputy into one of the most respected figures in New Mexico. He had survived gunfire, prejudice, and politics, and through it all, he never stopped believing in the power of one person's courage. He was no longer just the lawman who survived 4,000 bullets. He was the voice of a community, the face of justice in a wild and changing land. And though he carried his past like a badge of honor, he was already looking toward the future, a new era for New Mexico, and a new chapter in his extraordinary life. The sound of gunfire had faded from Elfego Baca's life, but the fight was far from over. After years of chasing outlaws and standing against injustice with a revolver on his hip, Baca had discovered a new kind of weapon, the law itself. He had survived the wild frontier, earned respect as a sheriff and U.S. Marshal, and now he was ready to take on a different battlefield, the courtroom. In 1894, Elfego Baca passed the New Mexico bar exam and officially became a lawyer. It was an achievement that few believed possible for a man born poor, Hispanic, and self-taught. But Baca had never been one to listen to doubt. He hung a wooden sign outside a modest office in Socorro, painted with a steady hand: Elfego Baca, attorney at law. Gone were the dusty cowboy hats and gun belts. Now he wore a dark suit, polished boots, and carried a notebook instead of a rifle. Yet everyone who came to see him knew, behind the sharp words and calm voice, was the same fearless man who had once faced down 80 armed cowboys. Baca didn't choose wealthy clients. He chose the ones who needed him most: the poor, the powerless, the people the system forgot. When ranchers cheated workers out of wages, he took their cases. When Spanish-speaking families lost land because of false contracts, he stood beside them in court. When a widow couldn't pay for a lawyer, he defended her for free. He often said, "The law is not for the rich or for the strong. It's for everyone, or it's for no one." In a time when Mexican Americans were often denied their rights, Elfego became their voice. He spoke fluent English and Spanish, translating legal documents for those who couldn't read them. To his people, he was not just a lawyer, he was hope in human form. Inside the courtroom, Baca was a different kind of fighter. His revolver had been replaced by sharp arguments and quick wit. He studied every detail of his opponent's cases, waited for them to make mistakes, and struck with precision. Some lawyers feared him. Others tried to out-talk him. But Elfego always found a way to turn the room in his favor. He could charm a jury with a single story or silence a room with a single question. Judges respected him, not because of his fame, but because of his focus. Even those who once doubted him began to admire his mind. He was living proof that intelligence could be just as powerful as a gun. In 1903, the people of Socorro elected him mayor. The town was growing, and so were its problems: crime, poverty, and corruption. Elfego didn't waste time. He built schools. He improved public safety. And he demanded that town officials treat citizens fairly, no matter their language or color. When business owners tried to influence city politics with bribes, Baca confronted them directly. He told one man, "Your money can buy you a house, not a conscience." The people loved him for his honesty. He didn't play politics. He practiced leadership. Later, Baca became district attorney for Socorro and Sierra counties. This time, he wasn't defending the accused. He was prosecuting criminals. He brought order to towns where lawlessness still thrived. He went after cattle thieves, smugglers, and corrupt sheriffs who thought they were untouchable. When one judge asked if he was afraid of taking on so many dangerous men, Baca replied, "I've been shot at by better men than these." His record was impressive. Criminals learned quickly that Socorro was no longer an easy place to hide. A voice beyond the courtroom, but Elfego's work didn't stop there. He used his position to speak for the Hispanic community across New Mexico. He wrote letters, gave speeches, and organized meetings to demand better education and political rights for his people. He urged the young to learn English, not to abandon their roots, but to strengthen them. He believed that understanding both cultures, Anglo and Hispanic, was the key to building a stronger New Mexico. He once told a group of students, "Don't let them tell you that you don't belong. You are the soul of this land. Learn, lead, and never bow your head." By the early 1900s, Elfego Baca was one of the most famous men in the territory. He was invited to political dinners, interviewed by newspapers, and even asked to run for higher office. But fame also brought enemies. Some politicians despised his honesty. Others mocked his pride, calling him arrogant and stubborn. He didn't deny it. He once laughed and said, "If I'm stubborn, It's because the truth doesn't bend. Behind the boldness, though, was a man who had seen both sides of justice, the cruelty of prejudice and the power of fairness. He carried the memory of every person he had helped and every injustice he had fought. The world around Elfego was changing fast. Railroads were replacing wagon trails. Telegraphs were connecting towns that once felt like separate worlds. And the old wild frontier was slowly turning into modern America. New Mexico was no longer just a territory. It was preparing for statehood. Elfego saw the change coming and knew his people needed strong voices in government. He encouraged young Hispanic men and women to get an education, to vote, and to take part in shaping their future. He believed the next battle wouldn't be fought with guns, but with ideas. By now, Elfego Baca had lived many lives. A boy who lost his mother, a deputy who faced death, a sheriff who tamed chaos, and a lawyer who gave justice a voice. But through all those lives, one thing never changed: his courage. Even his critics admitted that there was something unbreakable about him. He didn't just live through the Wild West. He outlasted it. In every courtroom he entered, in every case he argued, people still whispered his old nickname, the man who couldn't be killed. And though the gunfights were long behind him, Elfego Baca continued to fight, this time not for survival, but for justice, dignity, and the soul of New Mexico itself. By the early 1900s, Elfego Baca was no longer just a name from the past. He was a voice, loud, clever, and impossible to ignore. To his people, he was proof that a poor Mexican-American boy could rise in a world built to hold him down. To politicians, he was trouble, a man who refused to stay silent or obedient. The Wild West was fading. The outlaws were gone, but injustice still wore a badge. Land disputes, language barriers, and open prejudice replaced the gunfights of old. Baca saw it all and knew that courage alone wasn't enough anymore. Now his weapons were words, laws, and truth. He began traveling across New Mexico, speaking in town halls, schools, and dusty plazas. He told people to learn English so they could fight back with understanding instead of fear. He told them to hold their heads high. Education, he said, is the new revolver. Load it with knowledge, and no one can rob you again. As a lawyer and district attorney, Baca often clashed with rich landowners and corrupt officials. Many of them believed that New Mexico's Spanish-speaking citizens should have no voice in politics. Baca disagreed, loudly. He filed cases against unfair taxes and crooked business deals. When powerful ranchers tried to seize communal lands from poor families, he defended the settlers in court. He didn't always win, but he never stopped fighting. Some called him reckless for challenging men with influence. But Baca laughed and said, "They tried to kill me with bullets. Do they think paper and ink will scare me?" His fearlessness made enemies, but it also inspired a generation of young lawyers and activists who followed his example. Baca's biggest fights were not with criminals, they were with politicians. In the years before New Mexico became a state, corruption ran deep. Deals were made behind closed doors, elections were bought, and voices were silenced. Elfego Baca refused to play the game. He spoke openly about the dirty politics he saw. He wrote newspaper columns exposing greed and favoritism. He warned the public that power without honesty was just another form of banditry. One editorial he wrote ended with a line that became famous: "A thief with a gun steals once. A thief in office steals forever." That sentence made him both loved and hated. Friends admired his courage. Enemies plotted revenge. Despite the pressure, Baca stayed close to his roots. He continued to represent poor families who could not afford a lawyer. He kept his door open to miners, farmers, and widows who needed advice or protection. He never turned anyone away because of money. Often his clients paid him in beans, bread, or thanks. When asked why he didn't demand more, he smiled and said, "A man's stomach can be full while his heart stays empty. I'd rather fill the heart." In many towns, people began to treat him like a living legend. They called him Don Elfego, a title of respect. Mothers told their children stories about how he had once stood against an army. Teachers used his life as a lesson in courage and pride. The more popular Baca became among the people, the more the powerful turned against him. Some politicians spread rumors that he was arrogant, unfit for office, even corrupt himself. They hoped to destroy his reputation, but Baca fought back the only way he knew how, with facts and fire. He exposed their lies in public meetings and reminded voters who had truly stood by them when times were hard. He was not a perfect man. His temper was quick, and his pride sometimes too strong, but no one ever doubted his honesty. Once, when a wealthy man tried to bribe him to drop a case, Baca refused and said, "I took an oath to serve justice, not your wallet." He returned the money and took the man to court instead. When New Mexico finally became a state in 1912, Baca celebrated like a proud father. He believed the new government should belong to everyone, Anglo and Hispanic alike. He ran for political office several times, sometimes winning, sometimes losing, but always campaigning for fairness. He reminded people that heroes with guns could make history, but heroes with ideas could change it. He wanted schools in every village, bilingual teachers, and respect for both languages of the land. In speech after speech, he said, "This is our home. Our flag flies over all of us, and the sun shines on us the same. Let's build a new Mexico where no child feels like a stranger." Behind the strong voice and bold words was still a man of simple pleasures. He loved music, storytelling, and long rides through the desert. He laughed easily, but his eyes often carried the sadness of things he had seen. Friends lost, battles fought, injustices that never ended. He never married, but he was rarely alone. Friends and admirers surrounded him wherever he went. To them, he was a mixture of hero, teacher, and stubborn old fighter who never gave up. Even as he aged, he stayed active. He wrote about his adventures, mentored young lawyers, and continued giving advice to anyone who came to his door. By the 1920s, the world was changing again. Cars replaced horses, telephones replaced telegrams, but Elfego Baca's reputation remained untouched. He had lived through an era when courage meant survival, and turned that courage into something bigger, leadership. Some said he should retire, but he refused. He answered, "A man doesn't stop being himself just because time changes its clothes." He kept working, kept speaking, and kept believing that one person could make a difference. As years passed, young people who had never seen a gunfight still knew his story. They didn't remember the bullets or the courtroom drama. They remembered the message, stand for what's right. No matter the odds, Elfego Baca had gone from a boy who buried his mother in poverty to a man who gave his people pride. He proved that justice was not owned by the powerful. It belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. And though his revolver now gathered dust, his words still echoed through New Mexico's mountains and deserts, whispering a lesson the world would never forget. Courage is not in the hand that fires the gun. It's in the heart that never surrenders. Time is a patient sculptor. It smooths the sharp edges of heroes and carves their names into legend. By the time Elfego Baca entered his later years, the gunfights were gone, the courts were quieter, and the frontier he once tamed had turned into small towns with electric lights and paved streets. But the man who had once stood alone against 80 cowboys still carried the same fire in his eyes. Elfego's name had become more than a memory. It was a myth. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Children ran to his side asking for stories. Old men tipped their hats in respect. Some called him Don Elfego, others called him El Hombre que no podía morir, the man who could not die. At first, he enjoyed the attention. He would sit in cafes, spinning tales of the Frisco shootout or his days as sheriff. His storytelling was rich and full of color. Sometimes the bullets flew faster, sometimes the attackers grew in number. He didn't exaggerate to boast. He did it to keep the story alive, yet fame has a shadow, and even legends grow weary of carrying it. In time, Elfego realized that people no longer saw him as a man. They saw a myth carved from stone. They forgot he had feelings, doubts, and regrets. He was proud, but he was also human. The New Mexico of the 1920s and 1930s was not the world Elfego had known. The old cow towns were turning into cities. Law and order came in the form of judges and paperwork instead of revolvers. And while progress brought comfort, it also brought distance. People no longer looked to one brave man for protection. They trusted the system. For Elfego, that was both victory and loss. He had fought his whole life to bring justice to the frontier, and now that justice had arrived, it no longer needed him. Still, he found peace in watching his state grow. He said once, "When I was young, I fought for a land. Now I watch it learn to fight for itself." In his later years, Elfego moved to Albuquerque, where he opened a small law office. He didn't handle big cases anymore. Mostly he advised young lawyers or helped poor families write wills, settle land disputes, and defend their rights. But the visitors who came to his door didn't always need a lawyer. They needed a legend. They came to hear the story of the Frisco shootout told from the man himself. Elfego would lean back in his chair, smile, and begin softly. It was a cold morning in October, and I was just 19. Every retelling was slightly different, but one detail never changed: his faith, his courage, and his calm under fire. To those who listened, it wasn't just history. It was a lesson in standing firm when the world falls apart. By now there were books, newspaper articles, and even stage plays about him. Some writers called him a hero. Others said he was just lucky. A few claimed the shootout had been exaggerated. Elfego never argued with them. He would simply say, "The truth doesn't need defending. It stands on its own legs." He understood that history has two sides: what really happened and what people want to believe. And somewhere between those two, the legend of Elfego Baca lived on. As age caught up with him, Elfego's body grew frail, but his mind remained sharp. He walked with a cane, but his voice was strong and clear. He still met with friends, spoke at schools, and wrote articles about law and justice. He became a mentor to many young Hispanic lawyers who saw him as a trailblazer. He told them that pride must walk hand in hand with humility, and courage must never turn into arrogance. One of his favorite sayings was, "If you live long enough, the world will change around you, but never let it change who you are." Yet, even in his old age, controversy never left him completely. Some of his old rivals tried to discredit his stories. Others accused him of seeking fame. Elfego only smiled. He had faced real bullets once. Words could not wound him. Remembering the frontier, sometimes he would sit outside his home in the evenings, looking at the mountains glowing under the sunset. He would remember the boy he once was, the son of a marshal, standing barefoot in the dust, dreaming of justice. He thought of his mother who had died too soon. He thought of the little adobe house in Frisco, its walls riddled with holes but still standing, just like him. He lived long enough to see his homeland become modern, to see roads replace trails, and airplanes cross the sky where once only hawks had flown. The world had grown bigger, but courage, he believed, was still the same. In his 80s, Elfego Baca became a living piece of history. Journalists came to interview him, students wrote papers about him, and even Hollywood came calling. In the 1950s, Walt Disney Productions created a television miniseries called The 9 Lives of Elfego Baca, starring Robert Loggia. Millions watched it, and once again, his name echoed across America. When reporters asked how it felt to be portrayed on television, he chuckled and said, "I only had one life, but I lived it like 9. The show turned him into a national hero, but for those who knew him, he had always been more than that. He was a symbol, a reminder of what it meant to stand firm when standing was hardest." In his final years, Elfego slowed down, but never stopped working. He continued giving advice, sharing stories, and greeting visitors who wanted to meet the man behind the myth. On August 27, 1945, at the age of 80, Elfego Baca passed away peacefully in Albuquerque, New Mexico. There were no bullets, no battles, no crowds, just quiet respect for a man who had lived a life larger than legend. He was laid to rest in Socorro, the same land where he was born. People from across the state came to honor him: lawmen, judges, ranchers, and families who remembered his kindness. Even after his death, Elfego's spirit refused to fade. His story became part of the soul of New Mexico, told in classrooms, sung in songs, and carved into monuments. In the town of Reserve, where the famous shootout took place, a bronze statue now stands in his honor. It faces the mountains, unshaken, just like the man himself. Today, historians debate how many bullets were fired that day in Frisco, or how many men he truly faced. But those numbers don't matter. What matters is that one young man, with courage and faith, changed the way a generation saw justice. He taught that strength is not born from violence, but from conviction, and that even in a world of dust and danger, one person's bravery can echo forever. When Elfego Baca died in 1945, most people thought his story would slowly fade into the dusty pages of Western history. But legends don't rest quietly. They move from mouth to mouth, from books to screens, until they belong to everyone who still believes in courage. in the small towns of New Mexico. Older folks told the tale again and again, how a 19-year-old boy had stood against an army of cowboys, how 4,000 bullets couldn't touch him, how justice wore the face of a Hispanic lawman who refused to bow. Children grew up hearing it from grandparents who spoke with pride. To them, Elfego Baca wasn't just a man from the past. He was a symbol of what it meant to stand tall when the world tried to make you small. Teachers began sharing his story in classrooms. Writers used his name in poems, essays, and local newspapers. Each retelling added new details, some true, some imagined, but the heart of the story stayed the same. One man's bravery could change how a people saw themselves. In the years after World War II, America was hungry for heroes again, real ones, not perfect ones. The Wild West had become a myth, and television was turning those myths into gold. Cowboys rode across black and white screens, lawmen brought order to chaos, and audiences loved every minute of it. Then in 1958, Walt Disney Productions released a television series that brought Elfego Baca's legend roaring back to life. The 9 Lives of Elfego Baca, starring Robert Loggia. Millions of viewers tuned in to see the young deputy who faced down a mob and lived to tell the tale. Disney's version was part fact, part fantasy, but it worked. For the first time, national audiences saw a Mexican-American hero portrayed not as a bandit or sidekick, but as the brave, intelligent, witty lawman he truly was. For Hispanic families across the Southwest, that moment was electric. Their children pointed at the screen and said, "He looks like us." It was pride wrapped in television light. After the Disney show aired, Elfego Baca's legend spread beyond New Mexico. Comic books, adventure magazines, and history anthologies all told his story. Tourists traveled to Reserve, where the famous shootout had taken place, to see the bullet-scarred adobe house. Locals began holding small festivals in his honor. Over time, the line between history and folklore blurred even more. Was it 40 attackers or 80? Were there 4,000 bullets or 8,000? Did he truly walk out without a scratch? It didn't matter anymore. The facts had turned into something greater, a symbol of endurance, of courage against all odds. For decades, the American West had been portrayed as an English-speaking world of sheriffs, cowboys, and settlers. Hispanic, Native, and Black heroes were rarely shown, but Elfego Baca's story challenged that image. He became a Hispanic hero of the frontier, a reminder that the West belonged to many voices, not just one. His bravery gave young Mexican Americans something powerful: representation. They saw in him a man who looked like their fathers and grandfathers, standing shoulder to shoulder with the legends of the Wild West. Historians began revisiting his life with new respect. They recognized that he wasn't just a gunfighter, he was a lawyer, a leader, and a fighter for equality long before civil rights had a name. In the 1960s and 70s, several writers and filmmakers traveled through New Mexico collecting stories about Elfego Baca. Local historians preserved letters, court records, and photographs that proved the man behind the myth was every bit as extraordinary as the stories claimed. A monument was later built in Reserve, New Mexico, near the site of the shootout. It stands tall, a bronze statue of Elfego Baca, pistol in hand, facing the horizon. Tourists still stop to take pictures, reading the plaque that calls him the man who could not be killed. Every year, locals gather to honor his courage, not with gunfire, but with music, food, and pride. For New Mexicans, his name became a bridge between cultures, a story both Anglo and Hispanic could share with admiration. In time, Hollywood's glow faded, but the storytellers kept the flame alive. Radio hosts, podcasters, and history buffs rediscovered Elfego Baca's tale. His name appeared in documentaries, university lectures, and history podcasts that explored forgotten heroes of the West. Writers found new meaning in his defiance. They said he represented not just a man with a gun, but a spirit, a refusal to bow before injustice. Modern audiences, living in cities far from the desert, found themselves drawn to his courage all over again. He became a metaphor for anyone who ever stood alone and refused to quit. What makes Elfego Baca's story timeless isn't the bullets, it's the belief. He believed that law could serve justice, that education could free the mind, and that pride could overcome prejudice. He proved that true power doesn't come from wealth or position. It comes from the courage to do what's right when no one else will. Historians still debate how much of his story is fact and how much is folklore. But in the hearts of those who grew up hearing his name, that question doesn't matter. Because the truth of Elfego Baca isn't found in the number of shots fired, it's found in the fire that never went out. If you visit Reserve today, the desert still whispers his name. The wind moves through the canyons where gunfire once echoed. The old house still stands, patched and worn, a silent witness to one man's impossible survival. Tourists stop, take photos, and try to imagine what it must have been like to face 80 men alone. But the real power of that place isn't in what you see, it's in what you feel. A quiet strength, a promise that courage never truly dies. Every generation needs its heroes. Elfego Baca's story continues to live because it reminds people that bravery isn't born from perfection, it's born from conviction. He wasn't flawless. He could be proud, stubborn, and difficult. But when the moment came, he chose to stand for something greater than himself. And that choice turned a 19-year-old deputy into an immortal name. To this day, when people tell his story, they end it the same way. He stood alone. They fired 4,000 bullets. And he walked out alive. Legends never really end. They grow, they evolve, and they become mirrors for each new generation. Elfego Baca's story, born from dust, danger, and defiance, didn't stop in the 19th century. It lives on in the hearts of those who see courage not as a story from the past, but as a way to face the present. As decades passed, the name Elfego Baca began to mean more than a single man's bravery. It became a symbol, a message about what it means to stand your ground in an unfair world. For the people of New Mexico, Baca represented identity, pride, and the power of resilience. He wasn't born rich. He wasn't born into privilege. He came from a world that often told him he didn't belong, and he turned that rejection into strength. Schools began teaching his story not just as history, but as heritage. Teachers reminded their students that courage didn't always wear a uniform or a suit. Sometimes courage wore a dusty hat and carried a badge made of faith. For many young Mexican Americans, hearing Baca's name was like looking into a mirror. He showed them that heroes could look like their fathers, speak their language, and come from their towns. Over time, the myth of Elfego Baca grew taller than any cactus in the New Mexico desert. Every storyteller added a new detail. One said he faced 100 men. Another said 8,000 bullets were fired. Someone claimed his gun never jammed, his hat never fell, and his heart never shook. The truth? It didn't need numbers to shine. Even stripped of exaggeration, the real story was powerful enough. A 19-year-old deputy faced nearly 80 armed cowboys and walked away unharmed. That alone is enough to belong to legend. The myth didn't replace the man. It amplified his message. It made sure that every generation, even one without gunfights or outlaws, could still understand his strength. Behind the smoke and gunfire, Elfego's life offered deeper lessons. Justice means equality. He believed law was a tool for fairness, not control. In his time, that idea was radical and dangerous. Education is power. He told his people to learn English not to surrender their culture, but to defend it better. If they understand your words, he said, they can never silence your truth. Pride is survival. In a country that often ignored or disrespected Hispanic voices, Baca's pride was an act of rebellion. He stood tall, spoke loudly, and refused to be invisible. His courage wasn't just in facing bullets. It was in believing he belonged in a world that tried to tell him otherwise. Today, Elfego Baca's story has taken on a new life. He has become a symbol of Hispanic strength and resilience, not only in New Mexico but across the American Southwest. His name appears in museums, murals, and academic papers. College students study him as a symbol of early Latino representation. Writers compare him to modern civil rights figures. People who, like him, refuse to stay silent. Filmmakers still dream of retelling his story on the big screen, not just as a Western shootout, but as a human story about pride and perseverance. Because while guns and law badges belong to another era, courage never goes out of style. In every story of someone standing up for what's right, Elfego Baca's spirit flickers quietly in the background. Still, it's important to remember that Elfego Baca was not perfect. He was known for his pride, his temper, and his stubbornness. Some called him arrogant. Others called him fearless. The truth lies somewhere in between. He loved attention, but he also loved justice. He made mistakes, but he always stood by his beliefs. And maybe that's why people still connect with him today, because he wasn't a saint or a superhero. He was human, just like us. He felt fear, but acted anyway. He faced hate, but never gave it back. And when life tested him, he chose honor over comfort every single time. For modern Latino artists, activists, and storytellers, Elfego Baca remains a guiding star. His name appears in songs, books, and murals that celebrate Hispanic history. In Albuquerque and Santa Fe, artists paint him as part of the region's living soul. Half man, half myth. Every Hispanic Heritage Month, his story is retold as part of the foundation that shaped the American Southwest. He reminds people that courage is not limited by language, skin color, or origin. It is born in every heart that dares to defy injustice. Even beyond culture, Baca's story appeals to anyone who has ever stood alone, who has ever been underestimated, and who has ever refused to back down. In classrooms, young students learn that history is not made only by presidents and generals, but by ordinary people who rise when it matters most. Elfego Baca is their proof. His journey teaches that a hero doesn't wait for permission to do what's right. He simply acts. He doesn't seek fame, he earns respect. And he doesn't escape fear. He faces it head-on. These are the same values modern society still needs. In every protest for fairness, every court battle for equality, every voice that says no more, there's a bit of Elfego Baca echoing through time. In recent years, local historians and filmmakers have worked to separate fact from fiction, publishing new biographies and documentaries. Yet even they admit, what truly matters isn't how many bullets were fired, but what those bullets represented: the struggle of one man against injustice, fear, and prejudice. Every time his story is told, new audiences rediscover the same truth. You don't need armor to be unbreakable. You just need courage. More than a century after that fateful shootout in Frisco, the desert still carries his spirit. The mountains that once echoed with gunfire now whisper his name to travelers who pass through. Somewhere in that dry wind, you can almost hear him say, "They tried to kill me." But courage doesn't die. For all the legends of the Wild West, outlaws, sheriffs, and drifters, none stand quite like Elfego Baca, because his fight wasn't just for himself. It was for a people, a principle, and a promise that justice belongs to everyone. Time passes. Dust settles. Names fade, but some stories refuse to die. Elfego Baca's story is one of them. From a poor boy born in the rough lands of Socorro, to a fearless deputy who faced an army alone, to a lawyer who defended the powerless, his life became a thread woven deep into the history and spirit of the American Southwest. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't invincible, but he was real. And that, more than anything, is what makes his legend live forever. Every legend begins with a heartbeat, one moment that defines everything. For Elfego, it was that day in 1884 when he stood in a tiny adobe house while the world rained bullets around him. He could have run. He could have hidden. Instead, he stood his ground and said, "No one is above the law." That moment didn't just save his life, it gave meaning to it. It turned a frightened boy into a man who believed in something greater than himself: justice. And from that day forward, every choice he made carried that same heartbeat. Whether in a courtroom, a mayor's office, or the dusty streets of New Mexico, Elfego Baca stood for one thing: courage that doesn't ask for permission. When Elfego died in 1945, he left behind more than memories. He left behind a challenge to anyone who ever felt unseen, unheard, or underestimated. He proved that heroes don't have to come from power. They come from purpose. Generations later, young people still learn his name. They study the man who stared down 80 gunmen and walked away unhurt. They learn that bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's what you do in spite of it. Teachers use his story to remind students that no matter who you are or where you come from, your voice matters. That standing up for what's right will always be worth the risk. That one person's courage can echo through time like thunder across the desert. In New Mexico today, the legend of Elfego Baca still breathes in the wind. Monuments, murals, and history books keep his memory alive. His bronze statue in reserve stands tall, watching over the land he once defended. Tourists come and take photos. Children touch the base of the statue, tracing the letters of his name as if trying to draw strength from them. Old men tip their hats in respect. And somewhere, in the warm desert air, his story lingers, quiet but powerful. For the people of New Mexico, especially the Hispanic community, Elfego Baca is more than a hero. He's a symbol of identity, pride, and the promise that courage knows no language or color. He turned his life into proof that dignity has no border and justice has no master. Too often, history remembers men like him for their guns. But Elfego's greatest weapon wasn't his revolver, it was his conviction. He fought not for glory but for respect. He never chased wealth. He chased fairness. He never bowed to prejudice. He stood taller because of it. He taught that true strength isn't about how fast you draw. It's about how firmly you stand when everything tries to break you. His gun may have silenced his enemies, but his words outlived them all. Every few years, someone retells his story. A writer pens a new biography. A filmmaker dreams of another movie. A teacher uses his story to inspire a classroom. And each time his fire burns a little brighter. He belongs to history, but his message belongs to the future. He showed that justice doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be relentless. That courage doesn't require armor, it requires heart. That one voice, no matter how small, can still shake the walls of the world. If Elfego Baca could see the world today, he would probably smile. He would see people of all backgrounds working as police officers, judges, lawyers, and teachers, the same roles he once dreamed of filling. He would see young Hispanic men and women walking proudly, no longer hiding their language or their heritage. And maybe he would say, "This is what I fought for." He would still believe in justice, in equality, and in the strength of the human spirit. And he would still remind us, as he once did, that a man is measured not by how he lives, but by what he stands for. When you stand in the New Mexico desert at sunset, the sky burns gold and red like the memory of old battles. The air hums with silence, the kind of silence that carries stories. You can almost hear the echo of gunfire, the shouts, the heartbeat of a young man who refused to surrender. It's been more than a century since that day, but the lesson remains. Courage doesn't die. Truth doesn't fade. And legends, true legends, never fall. Elfego Baca proved that no matter how much the world changes, courage is timeless. He turned pain into purpose, danger into destiny, and fear into faith. That is why, long after his body turned to dust, his name still rides the wind. In the end, Elfego Baca's story isn't just a Western, it's a mirror. It reflects the struggle inside all of us, the desire to be seen, the fight to be respected, and the strength to stand when it would be easier to fall. So the next time life feels impossible, remember him. Remember the boy who faced 80 men and lived to tell the tale. Remember the man who fought for justice with nothing but conviction in his heart. And remember his unshakable belief that no one is powerless who refuses to give up. Elfego Baca's story doesn't belong to history. It belongs to everyone who still dares to believe in courage. "They said I couldn't be killed," he once told a friend. Maybe they were right, because as long as someone remembers my story, I'm still alive.